Hello and welcome to this episode of Trade Talk TV. I'm Lindsay Roundtree and today I'm joined by Shane Shevlin, who heads up marketplace development at IPONWEB. Welcome, Shane.
Thank you, Lindsay. Great to be back.
Great to have you here again, and this time with me rather than Kieran. I feel very fortunate. But today you are talking about curation, and so we're going to understand what curation is, why it's prevalent at the moment, and kind of what the future of curation looks like and how it fits into the MediaGrid and what you're working with at IPONWEB. So let's set the scene. What is curation? What do we mean by curation, and kind of how is it being used in the industry?
Yeah, so curation essentially means syndicating data and selecting inventory sort of further up the supply chain. And it sort of answers, I think, some of the needs that agencies in particular and data owners, but also publishers sort of had, I guess around about 2018 into 2019, to kind of take more control of their media buying, the application of that data against inventory, enriching that inventory, and delivering better outcomes ultimately in their media buying.
Interesting. So what are the kind of the key use cases of curation from an agency perspective, for data owners, for publishers? Kind of how does it work across the ecosystem?
Yeah, so I think that the core use case is just as I outlined. So it's syndication of that data together with your preferred inventory. And I think as the supply chain has evolved over the last few years, we have seen use cases evolve and new and interesting sort of applications of curation. Among them, and I'll list them here just for the benefit of the viewers. I think probably one of the more interesting recent ones is sort of responsible media acquisition or application of data from data partners that align with the interests and sort of values of a brand or an agency. So that's kind of definitely one of more recent sort of applications, as I mentioned. So
curation can help a buyer ensure they're targeting inventory, which could be from smaller niche inventory sources that seem to deemed to be responsible.
Yeah, exactly. So it could be based on your ethical sort of needs and requirements as a brand. It could be based on ensuring that data providers, for example, that you use are compliant with privacy regulations. It just gives you that sort of incremental level of control to be able to make the right choices around inventory selection and data application.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm. Second sort of interesting use case I think that we have seen, and this is probably one of the more probably common and earlier sort of applications of curation, which is audience extension. So 2-3 years ago, publishers, media owners, and their partners needed effectively to use some kind of a trading desk, perhaps get a contract with a DSP, costly minimums associated with that potentially. Made it difficult to extend audience. So by audience extension, I'm referring to sort of basing media buying against first-party data that a publisher will hold against their users. So I think now with curation, the possibility exists for a publisher to upload data into a curation platform and enrich the inventory, either select their own inventory and curate against that, or indirect supply potentially coming from other publishers, or in fact via other SSP partners as well.
That's interesting. So I'm thinking of audience extension. Can you use that in a kind of a non-traditional publisher environment, such as kind of maybe in CTV, for example? Are you seeing data owners use it in that way, curation?
Not specifically in CTV, although it wouldn't preclude the use of CTV inventory. But I think broadly, when you have a publisher, for example, who's either undersold or not undersold, oversold,
yeah.
And they need to basically fulfill an IO, for example, that a programmatic IO that is in need of additional scale. Curation is the perfect sort of activation channel for that, I think.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Cool. The third use case that we have seen as things have evolved, and this is obviously very topical, is the sort of testing canvas for ID vendors. So we're seeing in excess of 60 plus, I think, ID vendors or third-party IDs show up in the bid stream.
Wow.
Coming into MediaGrid. So that's kind of a massive challenge for media buyers and intermediaries to understand which are the most effective, which are driving addressability, for example, across which DSPs. I think curation again is the perfect canvas to just test and burn through ideas and understand, you know, who's actually performing well.
Yeah, interesting. And what's the final one?
Final one then is so management of your investment. So as a large agency, for example, so a holding group, for example, will have, you know, multiple opcos with multiple investment managers looking to try and understand, you know, how has this investment performed across not just one DSP but multiple top-tier DSPs, and sort of being at the intersection of, you know, supply, whether it be direct supply or indirect supply, and having that view across your sort of portfolio of investments across buying platforms. You get to kind of run analytics across the entire investment, understand which channels are performing, which media owners, media outlets are performing, but also additionally which media buying platforms are performing well. It also kind of allows buyers to, I guess, have a closer relationship with publishers directly. So to understand, you know, are there KPIs and SLAs potentially that are interesting for me to strike with individual publishers based on my investment? And to, at mid-campaign, for example, sort of boost spending or boost allocation based on certain things occurring within the campaign flight, so performance or, you know, reach goals being met or not met.
Interesting. It feels like curation has a lot of different use cases. There is sometimes a negative perception around curation. Kind of what are the reasons for that, and how are they being mitigated?
I think any negative perceptions or views around why curation is potentially ineffective, and if that is the narrative, are simply based on the fact that it is mainly disruptive rather than, you know, I can't think of a...
disruptive in a good way.
Yeah.
It affects the norm that people are used to.
Yeah, well, so I think a lot of data owners in particular, and also media buyers who are using, you know, who want to use the preferred data owners, have historically felt like they've been kind of, you know, limited to the vanilla options inside a DSP, for example. So transparency around trading and data usage has not always been that robust inside even the top tier DSPs. Curation kind of allows for a more sort of considered approach in how data is applied, but also how it's used, and to understand, you know, how it's being effective or not. And I think, yeah, that's pretty disruptive, obviously, but it ultimately is improving the performance of campaigns and delivering against, you know, the needs of brands.
Yeah, great, that makes sense. So I'm interested now in understanding how curation fits within the supply chain, and kind of, I guess, how MediaGrid ultimately fits within the supply chain, and how you're using curation to help both buyers and publishers and data owners.
Yeah, sure. So we can just map out sort of the very high level architecture of curation. So, you know, MediaGrid as a sort of holistic offering is an SSP. You know, it directly integrates with premium supply in most markets, but within the SSP itself, so we have our Curation Module, and this really is, you know, it's a combination of the ability to select preferred supply into a supply configuration, which ultimately becomes a PMP or a demand deal. Yeah. But behind this module, I think, and this is where, again, one of the USPs of curation comes to bear. You've got sort of a very good deal of flexibility around how data owners in particular, and I include publishers in this, get to sort of apply their data, and how in the back end we're doing matching against, for example, URL lists, whether it's cookie list based information authenticated on user logins. You know, the application of this data is, I think, frequently dependent on the scale of the data, and how the curator themselves will be selecting inventory. So I think a good deal of flexibility is required inside curation platforms such as MediaGrid to kind of understand what's the best approach here. And it also, I think, is kind of dependent on the limitations for how the publisher or the data owner can make the data available themselves. So, for example, we will work with very high-scaled data operations, like, for example, in the UK, Grapeshot, who have huge amounts of data, and our integration with them is a near real-time integration. Others, for example, will simply do a match against URL lists and match those URLs to segments so that we can sort of grab users on the fly as they come through in the bid stream based on those URL lists.
Okay, interesting.
So the second sort of component then of curation is, and this is mainly focused on our publisher integration. So publishers can use the platform to create their own PMPs based on their own organic inventory. And it's a combination of these two pieces then that ultimately result in a demand deal. We also, by the way, given we are an exchange or an SSP, have open market trading as well. So so this happens, and sorry, I'm slightly running out of room here. So this happens from the inventory supplied via our direct publisher integrations, which happen in the vast majority of cases via pre-bid. So we've built our own adapter to integrate that supply.
Okay.
And then on the demand side of things, so the kind of output or the end product of curation is always a demand deal or a private marketplace. And ultimately then our sort of top tier DSPs will sit behind this. And the list here is pretty extensive. So we've got, I think, in excess of 25 DSPs buying curated deals from us now. And then obviously the buyers, the buyer seats rather, are behind each of the DSP connections that we have into Grid. Now, I should probably just mention, sort of underneath all of this, we are sitting on top of BidSwitch infrastructure.
I was going to ask you where BidSwitch comes into play.
Yeah, so this is definitely a selling point, I think, for us, insofar as we have the opportunity to tap into additional supply, incremental supply, where we need it. So in markets where our direct footprint is perhaps not as complete as we would like, we are very strong in US, UK, France, major European markets generally, but we have the option to tap into major SSP supply, which we obviously route for these guys to a number of probably, again, tier 2, tier 3 DSPs in a lot of cases, but we are sourcing supply. So this supply can be included in your supply config setup for each of the curated deals that you're setting up to ensure that you fulfill scale requirements.
And that must make it interesting for the 4 points you talked about earlier, particularly where we're talking about more niche curation, like the kind of ethical buying or responsible buying, or actually being able to kind of tap into even more inventory via BidSwitch makes kind of you a bit more of a force to be reckoned with in terms of being able to go off these niche and actually get scale from curation through these more niche inventory sources. Yeah,
absolutely, Lindsay. And it just gives you kind of an additional perspective on what is out there, and to kind of sort of enhance and continue to enhance your supply paths. I think supply path optimization, because a lot of it was machine led at the DSP level, in some cases historically has kind of thrown the baby out with the bath water, so to speak. And a lot of curators really wanted to, again, just get that additional visibility on what was possible in terms of supply selection, and really just have control of that themselves in order to ensure that if there was a data enrichment piece happening as well, that they had control and that they were actually delivering the product that they had designed and built and wanted to sell into the media buyer, ultimately leading to better results generally.
Interesting. So actually curation works alongside SPO in that regard then?
Yes, yeah, I would say so. Yeah.
And so I'm interested in what you think the future of curation is, particularly, we talked about ID earlier, and obviously that's a massively important topic for buyers and publishers alike. How will curation help develop that and help make that a kind of a more you mentioned 60 ID vendors that you work with at the moment, and there's probably plenty more that are coming up through the rafters as well. Kind of how will curation help the future of that, and actually help the future of what the of buying looks like more generally?
Yeah, great question. So I think the sort of ID landscape is a prime example of why curation is useful. As I said, we sort of view curation as the next phase of supply path optimization for all of the reasons we kind of outlined. But perhaps none is more sort of topical at the moment than exploring sort of options for what happens post the impending kind of cookie apocalypse. And I think what we're seeing is really remarkable right now, but mainly in terms of the bid switch infrastructure and our sort of pipes into the sort of fully scaled programmatic landscape. So we're seeing huge numbers of ID vendors start to appear in the bid stream. I mentioned 60 plus. That number increases, it seems, every week.
Wow.
And I think media buyers are very keen to try to understand who's potentially effective for my clients, for my portfolio. Which of the ID vendors are actually delivering against addressability claims, and how are those addressability claims differing depending on which DSP is actually buying the inventory. Buying the deals. So I think curation provides a really sort of flexible canvas to start testing this stuff and really just begin to try and put a strategy together for 2023 and beyond.
So a buyer could effectively A/B test different ID providers through this platform then?
Yes.
Yeah. Wow. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. And kind of you've been working with different entities, different data owners, publishers, tech partners. What are you seeing from a perspective of how are they seeing growth, and how are they using curation to their benefit?
Yeah. So, besides kind of some of the more flagship names, I mentioned Grapeshot in the UK, but we also work with them globally, US and APAC, and also LATAM. We have a number of what I would call maybe just more fringe, but really interesting use cases around curation. We work with, I would say probably the contextual use case is the most common.
Right.
Unsurprisingly, with what's happening with persistent IDs.
Yeah, definitely.
We work also with Entity X in the UK, so those guys have seen some incredible uplifts in CTR in particular.
I saw one you mentioning earlier, luxury ice cream brand, 575% increase.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, so Tim, the MD over there, is waxing lyrical about some of the CTR improvements that they're seeing, and it's based on their technology. We're simply an activation channel to deliver that signal, that contextual signal, into a kind of prepackaged inventory setup and demand deal. So so what else? We also work, for example, in the UK with Avocet, if you know those guys. So
indeed.
Yeah, they have developed a really cool product they call LAMP, which is based on so they have panel data which they analyze around sort of eye tracking sort of experiments, and they essentially try and predict which placements will deliver the highest propensity for in-view duration, for longer in-view durations.
Okay.
And that ultimately then allows them to optimize the inventory that they're packaging into deals, distributing down to the DSP buyer, and I believe the results are pretty impressive there as well. So they are tracking a new metric. I think it's called APM, average predicted average predicted length per 1,000 impressions, or duration.
That's mind blowing.
Yeah.
APM, average predicted. No, so you've got to say it again.
APM, average predicted
You're
duration per 1,000 impressions.
Wow, okay.
is so they predict ultimately which placements are going to perform, and then pack those into a deal, and the media buying happens as it normally happens inside the DSPs.
Oh, that's cool.
Yeah.
So generally, it sounds like there's lots of good results. There's lots of different use cases, way of doing this. You're obviously very bullish on curation. What can we expect to see from curation? Can we expect to see more publishers getting involved, more buyers understanding what the benefits are? What are you hoping to see in the sort of next 6 to 12 months?
Yeah, so I think because curation enables all the participants in the supply chain to continue what they're doing, but simply to deliver better outcomes. Curation is here to stay. It's an enhanced way of trading media, essentially, giving levels of control back to media buyers, data owners, and publishers, and allowing them not just to enhance how they deliver campaigns, but to enhance the relationships that they have between each other as well, to negotiate directly, and to control the economics as well. So one of the things actually I didn't mention was the ability, within the infrastructure of MediaGrid, to have a direct relationship with the publisher, which includes payment cycles. So we offer an option to pay publishers directly as a curator, as opposed to having us as the clearinghouse. So
yeah, that's very interesting. In a world where transparency and direct relationships are becoming a really, really important aspect of the media buying cycle, that probably makes it a very attractive option for both buyers and publishers at the same time.
Yeah, it just gives more flexibility, and I think that's the key word here, is flexibility, both in the technology and what it can do and how you marry the data together with the inventory, and flexibility in how you kind of manage your relationships with the principals in the supply chain.
And is it easy? What do buyers and publishers, data owners need to get started in looking into curation?
So in terms of what's ready out of the box, we've got the supply, we've got top tier DSP demand. You're connecting.
You just need a DSP seat.
Yeah. So the DSP seat is the connector for this guy here, the demand deal, and so beyond that, you effectively need to sign an agreement with ourselves to get a curation seat, as we call it, so as distinct from the DSP seat. And the platform is super easy to use. A lot of the features and kind of workflow are very similar to what you see inside a DSP, just sort of one step further up the stream.
Right.
And ultimately you're creating a demand deal. So it's definitely not rocket science.
Everything's the normal process from there onwards.
I mean, on this piece here, so the Curation Module, so this does require, I guess, a consultative kind of period where we're sitting down with you trying to understand, well, how is it that you want to get data into our system, and how should we be making that data available for you to create segments, to match against segments in the bid stream and so on. Yeah,
which makes sense as part of a normal test and learn process, I'm assuming, right?
Yeah.
Brilliant. I mean, we had to end it there, but that's been really fascinating. Thank you for joining us, Shane.
My pleasure, Lindsay.
Intro Talk TV, and we'll see you next time.